morning, good evening, and good afternoon. Welcome everybody to this session on building alliances for early action mechanisms and capacities, as we've called it. My name is Thierry van der Horst. I work as a policy officer at the Security Policy Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, where I work on early warning, early action, with a specific focus on data-driven early warning. We organized this session today because the past days in this workshop we have seen many great examples of projects that have taken an innovative data-driven approach regarding prediction in the field of peace and security. And we have seen this international data for peace and security community grow tremendously over the past few years, and where many initiatives have seen the light and many ad hoc partnerships and exchanges came about. To consolidate this development and these efforts, we feel now is the right time to also look ahead, and that's very timely and interesting today, especially with the speakers we have with us. This community of practice is heading forward fast, and the right time is now to talk about what we need to ensure this continued fruitful collaboration and exchange. And we also think about how do we do this? What are the structures through which we can achieve our goals, and to make sure that the developments in this field are sustainable and also have the right infrastructure for collaboration and coordination. To talk about the future of this data for peace and security community and to reflect on the challenges and especially on the opportunities for alliances and partnerships in this field, I'm very happy to introduce today's speakers. I'm very grateful that they have all taken the time to share their thoughts and experiences with us. The first speaker is my colleague from Germany, Nicole Manger, and Nicole and I will moderate today's session jointly. Nicole works at the Department of Crisis Prevention, Stabilization and Humanitarian Intervention at the German Federal Foreign Office, where she works on integration of quantitative and qualitative early warning analytics. Also, we have with us today from the European External Action Service, Mr. René van Nes. Mr. van Nes is head of the Conflicts Prevention and Mediation Support Division, also known as ISP2. And he was previously the deputy head of division of PRISM, which is the Prevention of Conflict, Rule of Law, Security Sector Reform, Integrated Approach, Stabilization and Mediation Division. Also at the External Action Service of the European Union. And Mr. van Nes had a very long career with the European Union, also serving as coordinator of the BES Libya team and the head of economic section in the delegations to Ethiopia and later Tanzania, where he also served as head of the political section. And we're very happy to have Mr. van Nes with us today and are looking forward to his experiences and his contributions to today's session. Also, we have with us Jean-Martin Bauer. He works for the World Food Programme and has worked for the UN World Food Programme for over 20 years in many different countries, mainly in Africa. And he is currently the New York-based senior advisor on data, digital, and innovation. And I hope that Jean-Martin's experiences with the thematically slightly different but very much related challenges that can serve as an inspiration for our path forward. And his insights of best and worst practices can help us choose the right path. Welcome to you too, Jean-Martin. Also with us today is Kerstin Jouwe from the United Nations. Kerstin Jouwe has experience in advancing evidence-based strategies and organizational change in the UN humanitarian development and peace operations sectors. And currently, he serves as a senior planning officer at the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General, where he focuses on data, digital innovation initiatives, and is working on connecting the dots across the UN family. A prime example of this is the Secretary General's data strategy, for which Mr. Jouwe was the project lead. And also from the UN family is our final panelists who also helped organize this session, Martin Waehlisch at the DPPA, the Department for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. He helped found the Innovation Cell that focuses on new technologies, tools, and practices on conflict prevention, mediation, and peacebuilding. And Martin was also involved, as I said, in the preparation of this session, and I know that he will bring an interesting take on collaboration and coordination in this field, because the innovation cell at DPPA catalyzes innovation in peace and security while providing a forum for colleagues at UNHQ and in the field to engage collaboratively in human-centered design and problem solving. So now that I know that we know all the speakers a little bit better, I wanted to quickly go into the content of this session, but not before I've shared with you a couple of household messages. The first one is, please do share your questions in the chat box. We will try to answer them as we go along, but at the end of this session, we also have some room for Q&A. And a small disclaimer as well, because even though we invited everybody because of their organizational affiliations and their experiences, we wanted to note that because we cannot do Chatham House rules today, everybody is speaking on a personal capacity, and their views probably relate very much to the official stance of their organizations, but may not necessarily reflect those. So that is just a small disclaimer before we start. I'm very much excited about this opportunity to kick off this discussion, and I think the best would be to hand over to Nicole. As I mentioned, my German counterpart. Nicole, I would like to invite you to maybe share some first thoughts, or invite one of the other panelists to kick off with a small opening statement, or see where this discussion is leading us. We have very much a free format, and we hope that this conversation will be lively and interactively. Over to you, Nicole.
Yes, thank you so much, Thierry, and welcome to all of our speakers here. I'm very happy we are having this conversation because one of our biggest challenges here at the German Foreign Affairs is bridging the gap between the database methods and translating them into early action and making them relevant for end users, so for policymakers and for practitioners on the ground to have an impact. And so we have a lot of internal discussions on those questions, and it is a tremendous honor to have you with all your different sets of experiences and expertise come here and share them with us. I would like to start with this biggest question of how to translate data-driven analytics results into early action, make them relevant for policymakers. And I guess all of you have expertise that is tremendously helpful in that regard. I would like to address my first question to Jean-Martin Bauer, who has been a digital specialist at the World Food Programme, but at the same time has tremendous experience in the field. And so, my first question would go to you. Could you share your assessment of what the biggest added value data-driven methods bring to peace building and security, but also your experiences taking a look at the field, where you've worked in making them useful in terms of early action on the ground? Over to you, Martin.
Thank you. So two parts to that question. I'd say the first is about the type of impactful data that helps in the field. I would say that we're in a world where there's much more data than ever before, and sifting through it all has become a challenge. And an issue is for a decision maker is to have relevant data from his or her data unit in order to drive decisions. Now, what people who are responding to humanitarian crises, and I'm coming at this discussion from the food security, famine prevention angle, what's really helped us is when the experts agree, when there's consensus, and when the data is unassailable. And I would say that's something that the food security community has worked on for decades to get to a system of classification of the severity of food insecurity. So we've got 5 phases in the IPC, the integrated phase classification for severity of food insecurity. And that's a great trigger. It works very well. Everyone in the community knows about it. That wasn't the case at first. It took a long time to get there. But right now, as in the case of Tigray, people are saying you've got a phase 5 in Tigray. There's only 5 stages. So if you're saying Tigray is in phase 5, it's the worst, the most severe situation. So that sends a strong signal to decision makers. And I think the lesson you have there is that the managers and the analysts speak a common language, and they were able to get to a situation where there's a clear trigger for action. That's really important, and you don't always have it. In some countries with low resources, that system isn't in place. It takes years of investments, years of capacity building to get to a stage where you've got good data, you've got people who know how to use it, you've got clear triggers. So I've spent the last few years in Congo, and over there we don't have an IPC situation, but it is a situation, a country in a rough neighborhood, suffering from climate change, where you do have things that happen, and conveying that to government and to member countries to mount a response is extremely challenging because you're in that void. Now, the second thing I wanted to say about this whole debate is that data is great, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient for a response. Maybe this is obvious, and I'm sure it's been said before, but I did want to revisit that. In spite of the fact that the food security community has more data, even fancy tools that leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence, and I can talk about that a little bit later today, we do have a problem with late responses. The case that everyone knows about is the case of Somalia in 2012, where that phase 5 in the IPC scale, phase 5 famine, was only declared after more than 100,000 people had died. So we also need to look at the institutions that the data interacts with in order to have an appropriate response. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Jean-Martin. I want to bring in Kirsten Jauer from USG here, because this is basically what the data strategy from the Secretary General is aiming for, right? To build, to connect the data to the right institutions, build partnerships and communities, and really create an ecosystem of interconnected data, but also interconnected expertise on how to utilize the data, how to govern the data. And Kirsten, I would like to ask you, could you maybe just give a broad overview of what the maybe 3 main key aims or goals of the SG's data strategy are? And then also from your field experience, give us an assessment of, or maybe just outline 2 current projects that show are an illustration of how the SG's data strategy is implemented currently, and which progress it has shown on the ground already in terms of impact.
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here. Let me start off with a few words on the data strategy, and then maybe a little bit on why we believe that alliances for data matter, especially in crisis-affected and fragile states and settings. Happy to also speak a little bit to projects, but I think the colleagues here, Martin and Jean-Martin, are also incredibly well placed to speak to the specifics on that. So maybe on the strategy first, what is the SG's strategy about, and why does this matter here? His vision is to build a whole of UN data ecosystem that helps us act with more insight, impact, and integrity in the moments when that matters most for people and planet. So that's what we're trying to do, and let me unpack that a little bit, the basic assumptions behind that. And I want to highlight 3 here. The first is that we believe that the more data is connected, the more it can help us unlock value. That is the basic assumptions. Connecting data matters for insight, impact, and integrity. And if you want to do that well, and that's the second assumption here, that needs not just data, but an ecosystem. Nicole, you already mentioned that. And when I say ecosystem, I mean a smart mix of technology, people, knowledge, culture, partnerships. It's not just enough to finance a data set. And the third point is that if you do that well, if your ecosystem functions well, a few things become easier. And let me highlight 3. The first one being orchestration. And in the data space, that means the ability to create fluid connections between different data silos and to unlock insight, for example, for anticipatory financing. The second thing that becomes easier if your ecosystem works well is targeting. And that matters. It's about identifying who is in need and what sort of help do people require. And the third thing that becomes easier if your data ecosystem works well is matching. And that is about matching the demand for help with the right kind of supply. And I think the COVID context has shown us very clearly how important it is to be able to match well and to match fast. Now, so that's a few words on the strategy, and maybe a few more words on the on why we believe this these ecosystems matter most in crisis-affected and fragile states and require alliances that go beyond the UN family. We're an important node, but we're just one node of many. So the first point, and maybe, yeah, I'll try to do this in threes. So the first one is that in crisis settings, the issue is never one-dimensional. It's always multi-dimensional. It's always what we call in the UN a cross-pillar issue that goes across peace, security, development, humanitarian, and human rights concerns. Give you one example. In the SDG's prevention mechanism and his risk review mechanisms, we look at 13 different factors that can drive and trigger crisis, not just one. So that's why connection matters. The next point, I'd already pointed this out, in that in crisis-affected and fragile settings, it's never the problem of one, it's always the problem of many. Right? Governments, UN ministries, not just foreign ministries, development ministries, sometimes defense ministries, other senior advisors, governments, NGOs. And the third issue, and Jean-Martin spoke to that, is especially in crisis settings, you need to be able to translate signal into action, and you need to be ready for that. And what I mean by that is we need to make investments in resources that can finance action, and the SURF being one example, on the humanitarian space, but we have others. You need the decision-making process in the middle, but you also need to invest in signal, and that's what I'm looking forward to speak more about in this group. And let me just finish this off by with 2 points on why is this all worth it. We all work in the crisis in some 30 to 50 countries that need all of us. And if we get this right, we can do one thing. We can target better. There are 250 million people who need support. If we improve targeting by 1%, that's already 2.5 million people. That matters. Yeah? And if we match better the supply that we have with the demand that's out there, the 30 billion or so we collectively spend on crisis and fragile settings, if we can match that better with the demand that's out there, just by 1%, that's worth $300 million in money, and not even putting that into lives. And I believe strongly, and we believe strongly, that this only works if you build alliances, and if you invest in a substrate that we all need, the data platforms we need, the data sets we all need, the models we all need, and the community we all need to make that happen.
Thank you very much, Kerstin Jouwe. I think this is also a nice bridge to René van Nes, because similarly to what the UN is trying to do, René van Nes and his team is playing an important role in making sure that happens at the EU level. René, can I invite you to share some of your thoughts and experiences in this regard?
Yeah. Many thanks, Thierry, and thanks for having the opportunity to speak to this important panel today. It's really fascinating to hear the other speakers. One of the things that I note is already when we talk about early warning, that it's easy to actually mean different things across different organizations. When we talk about our early warning system, we talk about a system that looks ahead with 1 to 4 years. That means that we have the ambition to change the conflict dynamics, that we want to change how we approach a country and address these conflict dynamics. We also have something which we call horizon scanning, which looks 3 to 6 months ahead based on event data like ACLED. And that is in a way to be better prepared to deal with the crisis, as you can't within such a short time frame change the conflict dynamics. So let me talk about our early warning system. So early warning as in 1 to 4 years ahead, with the ambition to change those conflict dynamics. It's not yet out. We did an internal assessment, but I can share some of the findings. We look back at all the countries that we identified as early warning priorities since 2016. And what we saw is that we're actually pretty good in forecasting the eruption or escalation of a violent conflict. 80% of the countries that we prioritized since 2016 indeed saw an increase of violence after having been selected. And that's of course great, you can sort of be happy with that. But of course it's sad at the same time, because it means that you have not been able to deal with that you have not been able to prevent that conflict. So we started to look into that more. What can we do to be better in responding in early action? What do you do in order to remedy that situation? And that's not easy, of course. So we have really invested a lot in how do you translate your analysis, your understanding of what is the conflict risk into this is the action that you need to address it. So we are refining that methodology to translate analysis into action. And we learned a few things, and maybe I can share that here if that is relevant. One of the things that we learned is that if you want to prevent a conflict, you have to be sufficiently detailed. You really need to be clear in what it is that you do. You need to link it to programming, you link it to money, you link it to very concrete support. We also learned that you need to have the member states, our member states in this case, buy in to really make this happen. And what we also learned, this is nothing new of course, is that basically everyone is too small to really prevent a conflict, and you need to work together. And I think that brings it very nicely to the objective of today, that we need collectively not only to agree on the data that we use, but also on how are we going to coordinate and align our response to the analysis that follows the data and the early warning signals that we get on the basis of that data. Maybe that's enough for now. I'm very happy to talk a lot more about either the GCRI, the conflict risk index that we use, or the data for peace portal that we have. You just tell me what is most relevant for this session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, René. And maybe I can invite Martin to share his thoughts on one of the last points that René made. How can we look forward and make sure this coordination and this collaboration comes about? I believe you've, in many ways, are trying to do the same thing. I invite you, Martin, to share some reflections about that topic, or maybe any other topic you feel is in need of a discussion at this moment.
Thanks Thierry and Nicole. Great that we're having this conversation together. Feels a bit odd because we don't see our audience. We are so used to those Zoom calls, but it's nice that at least we speak to each other. A few thoughts from my end. I'm just going to pick up on what René said in the end. I think when it comes to early warning, we need to become monodirectional for decision making, where the data becomes so compelling that there's no other way than make a single decision, right? And that I think could be based on three things. One is communication, in terms of how we present the data. And just to give you an example, in the DPPA Innovation Cell, we work on data visualization, right? To describe how very complex data points could be relevant for decision making. That's one thing that I think keeps the whole UN busy, so that not everybody needs to have an MA or PhD in data science, but still, is able to read a chart. Second point is, I think, with regard to the process design, I think what we discovered over the last 15 months of the existence of the Innovation Cell is that once we create a process that brings senior decision makers, analysts on board, at the same time, for the definition of early warning parameters and the communication path, through this greater buy-in, there's a greater willingness to act upon that, right? Instead of just tabling results, here's the Excel file, here's the chart. When we create a much more inclusive process, we have this alliance. It's not just a partnership, it's a true alliance in-house, in organizations. And I think that's going to be something we will work on in the future. And the third part is really this interactivity of data exploration. So I think that's what Kers already alluded to when he talked about multiple pillars and different sectors as well. And just to give you an example from our work, which uses virtual reality, for instance, right, to give decision makers in New York a feeling for what it's like to be on the ground in Iraq, in Yemen, in Colombia, where data is not the kind of the main player in the story, but informs the overall storytelling. And I think that's an important part for alliance building as well, because the different ways of how we present the information and how we make kind of those data points immersive are very important so that the action is actually taken. Now, what I really liked about the title of this session, and I don't think we proposed it, I think it came from Thierry or Nicole, was the term alliance, which is different than partnership. So let me just unpack that in 3 steps, in my personal opinion. So number one, I think, and Jean-Martin talked about this, the alliances are built on principles, right? Otherwise, just a partnership. They're principles. We have seen security alliances, we have seen different kind of alliances, right? So that we speak what Jean-Martin called the common language, for instance, right? Where we agree on certain standards, so we can compare apples with apples and different types of apples with different types of apples and so forth. So the common agreement on principles, and that's a really tough one when we think about creating those alliances, for member states, international organizations, regional organizations. But I think that's one important ingredient. The second factor is that alliances depend on the opportunity to help each other out when needed. For instance, when we lack data, and to give you an example here, we have a project where we use geospatial information to predict water shortage in Iraq and the Middle East, and that is built on alliances to the European Space Agency and NASA and other open source geospatial data set that can be used. And I think that is something, I think that should be the future of this Data for Peace alliance, right? So not just a partnership. And a third element, the third ingredient is I think that we need to build things together, and that we leverage each other's knowledge and talent. And I really love that conference for the last days, because I learned so much what's going on in different foreign ministry, what's happening in terms of what different private actors are doing, NGOs and so forth. And one common belief we have in the DPPA Innovation Cell is that we need to build solutions that are open source to the extent possible, so we can actually share them as an alliance. So they're not just caved in. And most of the work we do is funded by taxpayers' money, so we give it back to the world. And there's a whole movement led by USG and Global Pulse when it comes to data philanthropy, for instance, that we kind of try to put into action, while also balancing, of course, kind of privacy issues, when it comes to data for good, and we know about certain constraints, but to have this as a matter of principle. So again, that kind of having a set of principles, help each other out when needed, and building things together, I think that then it becomes a true alliance. And I think we are slowly getting there. So I'll pause here. Back to you. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. I was waiting for Nicole to jump in, but
I was waiting for you.
That's okay.
Should I go forward?
Please go ahead.
Yes. Okay. All right. No. Thank you so much, Martin. Actually, I guess what you outlined very well aligns to one of our current initiatives that the U.S., Dutch Foreign Affairs, our British colleagues, and the EU are currently initiating or negotiating, basically, which is the Data Trust Fund. So this is really something where we have also been very strongly involved with the USG, so Kirsten and his colleagues, because we really see a need for, not only joining forces in terms of sharing expertise and knowledge and talking about how to mobilize political resources, how to align our strategic interests, but also in terms of joining forces for funding and financing pooled financing tools for data. Because so what happened in the past here for the German Foreign Affairs was that our funding, for example, for GTD, the Global Terrorism Database, which is a critical data source for our early warning system, it ended early, and the UK FCDO funding started late, and there was no coordination between our funding. So the basic result was that we had a whole year of a lack of data access in the regularity where we usually have access to them. And this was a huge problem for our early warning system. And so we started to talk to our UK FCDO colleagues, to our US colleagues, and we really saw the need for joining forces and coming together here and really coordinating funding, basically to make really sure that we have the data we need, but also to introduce common quality standards that are internationally aligned and also of high scientific standards. Also the thought of really funding joint initiatives, joint projects, as Martin outlined. And so, yeah, I don't know, Kerstin, maybe you want to come in as well, and maybe just align this with a bigger SG's data strategy, where you see the key added value of such a data trust fund, and maybe also relate a bit to the OCHA Humanitarian Data Center and its experience of setting up such a data hub, basically, not only a financing tool, but really setting up a whole data hub. Yeah, what the added value is of such joint data hubs, but also joining forces for funding.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Let me start with the latter. So from our perspective, and you already mentioned our engagement, the idea of a joint trust fund or of a joint pool of resources that can power an alliance, that can power a very specific partnership is outstanding. It resonates incredibly well with the SG's vision of creating ecosystems, because we cannot, as I said, succeed on our own. This requires connections, and it requires a substrate that gets a flywheel in motion in a sustainable manner. At the moment, we see a lot of fragmentation, certainly within the UN system, where funding is sprinkled here and there. If you want to grow an ecosystem where we currently have a desert, we need to deal with that fragmentation. And you mentioned already, Nicole, we see stop and go. Of course, all of us in the UN system have to deal with stop and go in funding. That isn't helping you, that isn't helping us. So it's about creating, or the choice we're making in either sprinkling a little bit here or there, or concentrating some of the soil that we have and build a more fertile ground for a flywheel that can work. Now, what's the added value of the trust fund as we see it? Well, on the one, there are three. One is lower transaction costs, of course, for all of us. Second is the higher inside value that we see, because we have better connections. We can improve, as I said, targeting, matching, assessments, and acting faster. And then there's the impact value, and I already referred to that. Think of the 250 million people in need and the difference we can make if we choose to do that 1% better. I'll give you another example. Some of you might be coming from the peacekeeping community. Every battalion we deploy costs $29 million a year. And the question is, where are they best deployed, when, and for what? And how many of them, for example? And that's a question of evidence. So see tremendous value in the trust fund, and we believe this can work. And the HDX, the Humanitarian Data Center, is a great example of infrastructure that we all need. Nicole already referred to data sets that we all need. There's infrastructure we all need. There are frameworks we all need for risk assessment. There are models we all need. There are standards we all need. And in HDX, we see this flywheel in motion, where the team over the last few years, with support from all of you, has created a platform that has attracted ever more users, that have contributed ever more data, and has become now the key node in the humanitarian data ecosystem. In fact, we're going to, in 2 weeks, look with the Secretary General and his entire senior management team at HDX and the lessons the UN system can learn from that as we strengthen our data platforms. So we see that success is possible, and all of us here on the team, I think, are both clients of HDX, contributors, and also provide examples with our own projects for how success is possible.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kirsten. Actually, it brings me to another point. Not only what we can learn from the Humanitarian Data Center here for a possible center on peace building and prevention data, and for the Trust Fund specifically, but also in terms of our models, our crisis prevention efforts. I mean, the whole humanitarian assistance community has they have great prediction models, they have very automated processes in terms of when they intervene, threshold standards in terms of forecast-based financing. And I was wondering, drawing on your expertise, how could we strengthen those overlaps and the experience we have in different communities like humanitarian assistance and make them usable for the peace building and prevention context? Because I guess this is really a new field, utilizing data-driven methods for prevention. And of course, it's a whole different environment here, because we have this political environment here when compared to the more neutral humanitarian principles. But I guess there are some overlaps and possibilities to learn from each other or learn from other fields. And I don't know to whom I would address the question, maybe to all of you, whoever feels most inclined to answer first.
Look, I can jump in quickly. I'm sure Renee and Martin have thoughts to add, but certainly there are links between both areas, and it's quite artificial, the distinction we make between humanitarian and conflict prevention. If you look at the people who live in pre-famine conditions in the world, it's between 150 and 200 million people every year. The vast majority of them are in conflict settings, so we're closer than we think in terms of thematic overlap. But I think what I wanted to say is that all the data that we use for hunger analytics can also be used for peace and security. I was sharing a platform that's existed for a few years, the Hunger Map Live. I hope you find that in the chat for those of you who are listening. Check it out. It's a model that forecasts hunger, that nowcasts hunger on the basis of a series of indicators that's available publicly. So these indicators include rainfall, vegetation, food prices, the night lights. I mean, you've got a set of indicators that help us predict and nowcast hunger, even in places where we can't send teams or where we can't do surveys. These are the things that we can now do with the technology these days. And this confirms something that Kirsten was saying earlier. The data sets that are out there, they're really common property. They should be considered a commons. They should be considered a global public good, not just for the food security community, but for all the agencies that work in the same fragile settings. You will see that what we've done with the hunger map at WFP is the same type of thing you could do for conflict in other areas. And therefore, we would really have benefits from treating this like as a data commons. This issue would be to set up a data commons that we could all tap into. And the benefits are also go to developing new analytical products. The issue you might have had in the past with the analytics is that the data might have been old, or in some areas it's a gray area on the map and you're not really sure what to do. If you look at the maps for the DRC, you've got big gray areas because it's just too dangerous and no one knows what's going on. But if you have a data commons and you've got models that process the data, you get away from that. You start seeing what's going on where you couldn't before. And we need to be able to enable that through the right data policies. And I think this trust fund is one of them. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Jean-Martin. I hear Renee coming in. Please, Renee.
Well, there was a general invitation to come in on this, and if you want, I can share a few thoughts. Here I need to say that I'm not responsible for EU funding here. So whatever I'm saying is indeed in my own capacity, as I'm not the person who will take any decision there. I think it's tremendously important, and I really welcome the initiative. As in this world where we are sort of living in a post-truth society, it's really important to have a common base that we can all agree upon. I really like what Martin said on the need to communicate, to make it compelling. He talked about making it so compelling that we become monodirectional. I understood that the data basically forces you to take action. I mean, that's almost a dream, of course. I think it's what we see is at this moment, what I see is a huge gap between the people that work with data, that understand them, and the final decision makers. And so if we're going for such an alliance, for a trust fund, then I would strongly argue that it is not only about making sure that we have the data, but it's also that we bridge that gap between those that are providing the data and those that want to use the data. So it's tremendously important to make the translation, to make the data so compelling that people indeed understand that if this is happening in terms of food security, climate change, etc., you need to act. So if we are able to do that together, jointly across the institutions, then we really won a big battle. So I'm really in favor of that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just responding to what you said, Renee, I guess this is really important, and it also relates back to what Kirsten and Martin said, basically bringing different communities together. So I guess also in the product design of our data-driven tools, bringing the scientific community in to ensure a scientific validation of our products, but then of course also bringing in practitioners and the end user perspective. And I guess this should not be done at the end when we kind of use our products or make them marketable, but really be done at a very early age at the when we design our products to really bring in this end user perspective. And so yeah, what I really hope to see in such a trust fund or in any data hub for prevention and peace building is really this being a platform or a hub for bringing different communities together, bridging the gaps between silos and enabling this exchange between the different perspectives to create better products that are more, as Renee said, more actionable for policymakers in the end.
Very well put, Nicole. I think I can agree. There's some questions coming into the chat, and when I look at the clock, I also see that we've got only 15 minutes left. Well, yeah, let's see. Maybe we can combine two things. I think, Martin, you wanted to share some thoughts on this last topic and on the future as well, and maybe you can combine your answer with questions about collaboration, coordination. Our friend Gregor asked a question about how this ties in with the World Bank efforts. I think you can also elaborate a little bit more on that. Please, Martin, floor is yours.
Thanks, Thierry. And I also see a question about civil society partners. I think, you know, the more the merrier. I think what we've learned, and many of you are familiar with the work of Nate Silver on forecasting and prediction. We often carry arrows, right? And peer-reviewed journals and data sets, we carry the arrows form. And what we've seen is that there's an obsession with prediction, but an incapacity with good prediction. And that, you know, although kind of major trend analysis works more or less when it comes to pre and post-election violence, for instance, the Black Swan events, they're very hard to like the weak signals are so hard to get, right? So we're getting better. And I wanted to pick up on something what Nicole said, that, you know, this is new. I'm a big fan of history, and there's a good piece of writing on the arms race prediction between the USA and the USSR, and a bunch of literature started in 1980, you know, even earlier, 1972, on even artificial intelligence. The word was used, artificial intelligence and forecasting of conflict. So this has been decades ago, but at the time, technology was kind of housed in big data warehouse underground and only accessible to a few individuals, right? You had to have special clearance to look at the data sets and, you know, get the final report. Now, you know, all of us have a supercomputer at the fingertip, right? Like a mobile phone fits into the palm. Like the computing power, you know, is unmatched when it comes to the capacities we have. And I wanted to make another point on the future, which is that when it comes to early warning and data in general, I think this is not just as we learned, many of us, this is an interdisciplinary field. This is not just for statisticians. This is not just for, colleagues that have a background in mathematics. This is a crossover of design, social science, and many other sciences. And I think that's where the innovative part comes in. And I want to make a third comment on the PowerPoint trauma. So I feel what has been, exemplified over the last decades was that whenever there were presentations made on complex data issues, that there were stuff into PowerPoint presentations. So whenever we try to restart that conversation now, there's a kind of an autoimmune response to that. Please not again another slide with charts on that. And Kerstin can speak to that, because I think that culture has changed also in the UN, where we have come up with much lighter formats that are much more engaging, easy to be understood by the many cultures that we bring together in our organization. And that's not just a generational gap. I think this is really kind of also a cultural issue, right? How do we look at data? Like, how do we visually look at it, right? What colors do we use to connect the dots and so forth? And I think we shouldn't be trapped in the risk of oversimplifying things either, right? Like this binary thinking that, tell us, will there be another war here or there? Or like that's, then we would, and at the same time, we are often trapped in overcomplicating, overcomplexifying things. Oh yeah, I can tell you under the condition of, read my manual, 120 pages. So I think these are kind of the challenges we will continue to face in the future, like to avoid oversimplification and over complexity as well. And to make a pitch here, and in DPPA, DPO, we're working on a peace and security data hub. It's not public yet, but will be made public very soon, where we are learning the lessons from HDX and other data hubs. The World Bank has I think spearheaded that in the future. And Kerstin talked about the desert, right? And I feel maybe we have a desert with a lot of oases, right? Many oases. We need to find to build water pipes between them. That's the conversation we have in the UN. I think it's not a complete desert, but we have an oasis here and oasis there. How do we create water pipes? How do we make this sustainable for the dry season, right? And I think that's how I imagine the future of the whole field develop, where through those infrastructure projects and programs, we introduce data literacy en passant, right? At the side, we introduce data literacy. We lift up the quality of how we use the data for decision making. And just think about COVID, right? How fluent the general public is now in data, like flattening the curve, right? You can stand at a bus here in New York City and talk about flattening curve with anybody. People know what that means. And I think the pandemic has been maybe that's a silver line, has been opportunity in that regard to push that field forward. So I'll pause here. Just some thoughts from my end. Over.
Thank you, thank you, Martin. There's some questions in the chat regarding the link between early warning and early action, and how we can translate that, and if there maybe are some examples from our experiences. And I believe both Kerstin and Jean-Martin are well capable to answer those and to maybe give some examples to the audience. I want to ask you to keep it brief so we can also continue to some other questions, but please, first, Kerstin.
Right. Maybe let me start with one concrete example of how we've worked within the UN system to strengthen the link between insight and action, and do that in a structured manner and build a community around it. We have a process to scan essentially risks to mandate implementation at country level. It's a risk review mechanism that feeds directly into the discussions that the Secretary General has on a monthly basis with his senior management team. And in the past, that process was very much based on, let's come all around the table and let's talk about how we see the situation in region XYZ. And that's been useful, but we've strengthened that process over time so that it is more structured and fact-based. So what does that mean? We basically drive that process, the selection of which country situations we talk about, on the basis of composite indices. And Renee already referred to some of those products that help us look longer term and short term. Where are risks growing? Where are they acute? And we use those indices to help us filter down and structure the discussion. Once we decide on a country, we then have a 13-factor risk model that helps us inform which risks are most important to talk about for country XYZ. And facts are good, but we've really learned here that facts are not everything because we're dealing with people and with processes. So we enrich these facts with the perceptions of colleagues across the UN system. And we try to reveal these perceptions before we come to the meeting so that we all already understand how do we see the situation and where do we see priorities. That's something that we have changed. And then we have a structured process for escalating situations to the senior management level through a cross-pillar group at Assistant Secretary General level up to the SG. And that then helps us drive, for example, how we allocate senior management time, how we allocate funding from shared resources, pooled resources, how we surge capacity. And maybe last point on that, we're in this process, we're connecting the UN community, but we're increasingly also connecting other international organizations. So for example, the IMF is now a regular participant in those risk review mechanisms because we understand that, of course, macroeconomic risks can be major triggers of violence and conflict at country level. And that's been a super useful process for us. Happy to speak to other contexts, for example, our reconfiguration of UN engagement in the Sahel, or how OCHA uses better signal to drive anticipatory financing.
Thanks so much, Kirsten, for your thoughts. Jean-Martin, do you want to add something to?
Sure, I'll add to Kirsten's comment on what OCHA's been doing. There was a good example of how OCHA was using data to provide support to release SURF funding before the disaster hit. That was the case in Bangladesh a few months ago. I think that's the best known case. So what we're showing you or telling you about here today is not electrons on a screen. It translates into help to people. As a WFP country director in Congo, I can also tell you that we had a very strong link between data and the institution. So again, the data I was telling you about isn't there for a screenshot, or it's not just electrons, it drives decisions. And let me tell you about those a little bit. In the policies that we have in the system at WFP, a country director is able to mobilize $200,000 in funding, preparedness funding, when there's a risk of a crisis in a country. So once you've got data and you think that the level of the risk is high enough, you do get funding to help the country office prepare. We triggered that in the Republic of Congo ahead of the elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo to boost our capacity along the river to detect refugee arrivals. And we did get close to 20,000 refugees. That's a simple example. But then when the refugees arrived, I had the delegated authority to ask up to $1 million in funding to provide cash transfers to the refugee population. So the analytics we do, and all this was informed by high resolution satellite imagery that we were collecting, thanks to the imagery provided by Planet. That shows that the right data can drive the right decision, provided that those links within the organizations between the data and between the funding mechanisms and the intervention tools is made. So it's there. I'd like to add a bit of a consideration also. So it's not all about do we forecast a crisis or not. So it's good to know, as Renee said, that we're able to predict 80% of the conflicts that take place. But one of the problems I've seen, at least in the food security community, is we don't always understand the crisis well enough. So you've got that binary problem or no problem, but then what type of problem do you have exactly? And that's really key to having the right response. For us involved in humanitarian aid, one of the key decisions is to understand whether we need to bring in food or bring in cash, very different types of response. And quite often that's super tricky to do. And I'd also hope that when we talk about forecasting, it's also forecasting the type of crisis we're facing to help us do the right thing for the people who need assistance. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, Jean-Martin, this is really something that we are working here on in the German Foreign Affairs right now as well. So actually, we started with those global top-down models of global risk scanning, and as you said, like those are binary. But we are now like developing complementary models that are more regional and more context-specific to bring in the structural dimensions and really analyze more in depth the conflict drivers. So this is something that is yeah, very, very fascinating development. But I want to go back to Renee, because what Kirsten outlined about the risk scanning process, I guess, is very similar to what the EU is doing in its early warning system with the GCRI, and starting with a quantitative-based risk scanning, but then bringing in the experts to have a more in-depth assessment, and then going to the country assessments. But I would like to hand over to Renee again to maybe elaborate a bit from the EU perspective on that.
Yeah, many thanks, Nicole. Indeed, we always stress that you need to have a qualitative approach to complement your quantitative approach. So data is for us the starting point. Data point to the probability that a country or a context will go into a violent conflict. That's indeed binary. It tells you, yes, there is a high probability. Then we select a number of countries where indeed we feel that that's a serious risk that is going to happen, where we feel that as the EU we have leverage to do something about it, and where we therefore decide to take that further. Then we make a huge investment. We make an investment by, well, now that's a bit difficult, but by going to the country to have what we call an integrated approach mission. We take the colleagues from all the different entities of the European Commission that are relevant, indeed our colleagues from ECHO, the humanitarians, the development cooperation colleagues, security colleagues where that's relevant, and we make an in-depth analysis. So the data already give us an idea of what exactly was it that pointed to that higher probability. The data already gives us an indication, but then we make a qualitative analysis to really understand what is it. Once we have identified what the key drivers are of the conflict, then we move to what are the options for action, as we call that. So what are we going to do about that? So that is a fully qualitative process. There's no data involved anymore. If colleagues have suggestions on how to make that more quantitative, I will be interested. Later we monitor, and then maybe data start to play a role again. In an ideal world, what you would like to see is that the data that pointed to that high probability of a risk would then be lower. You know, you would see that the data reflect your actions. Well, we're not there yet. I think we need to bring more of a collective power. If we could do that as the EU, as the UN, as regional organizations together, well, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could see the data reflect our actions? You know, we were worried about this particular element. Look what we did, and as a result, 3 years later, we see it reflected in the data. We're not there yet, but let's dream. Let's build an alliance, and indeed, the Trust Fund knows one day we will be able to get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee, for your nice last words, and I think it's a hopeful note to end on. Unfortunately, we're already at the end of this session. There were some other questions in the chat that were very good, and we could have spoken about those for many more minutes, but unfortunately we have to finish. I would like to invite everybody that still has a question to reach out either via LinkedIn or through email. And Jean-Martin and I spoke before this session, and we said this is, we can only scratch the surface of the way ahead for us, but I think this has been an interesting start. It's very nice to see that everybody's so enthusiastic about this and really wanting to take this forward. It's not all going to be easy. There's a lot of challenges ahead as well. A lot of coordination efforts that need to go into this. One of the questions was about that. When you try to coordinate your action, it also means that your action will be slower. How do we take that into account? Some very other practical questions in the chat that way maybe we can elaborate on later. But for now, I unfortunately have to close. I want to thank everybody that joined us here this afternoon or this morning. And I especially want to thank Jean-Martin and René and Gaston and Martin and Nicole. It was very interesting to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure this will not be the last time we speak. Thanks also to Esther, the technical moderator, for this session, and I hope to see you all in a physical setting maybe very soon. Thank you very much.